morning, everyone, and welcome to this fine Tuesday morning. Um, so I thought today I would talk a little bit about a particular popular law um, that we do get questions on from time to time, but it is one of those little legal hide and seek games that the legislature has sort of liked to play with us. Um, okay, fence viewing. So today we're going to talk kind of about the scope of a township's duties under this law. So kind of what cases we actually have to start doing stuff with, sort of what can go wrong potentially if we don't do it. We're going to talk about some of the exemptions that this thing has, and in particular, I think these are probably among the most unusual features that I've seen in a piece of law affecting township legislation, and then affecting township in general in Minnesota. And then we'll have some additional resources at the end for folks who are interested in this. Okay. Now, most of the time, whenever we are dealing with a private dispute between two landowners, the advice that the association gives is don't get involved. Most of the time, that's the business of the court system. However, in this particular odd little context, this is something that we do have authority over. And in fact, if we don't do it, we can potentially get in trouble. Now, one of the interesting things about this law is it's actually older than the state of Minnesota itself. This thing was in place back when we were a territory. But let's talk a little bit about sort of the modern incarnation of this thing. So it's in Chapter 344 of Minnesota statutes. And here is kind of the basic hook that gets us in here. Supervisors in their respective towns are fence viewers. So city council members, commissioners of public works, city trustees, they all potentially have this too, but as a practical matter, given some of the other limitations of the law, this really is about us. This applies to us. Those other folks, while technically they are, potentially on the hook for this sort of thing too, as a practical matter, it would be a little bit weird for that to actually happen to them. Now, okay, so one of the first things that I always do when taking a look at a statutory scheme is what happens if we just don't do it. And in this case, there is actually a penalty. So it's Minnesota Statute 344.17. A fence viewer who unreasonably fails to perform a duty required by this chapter shall forfeit $5. And we mentioned that this is a very old statute. You can tell that from the penalty provision here, to the town or city. But the point that you probably want to be much more concerned about potentially here is this next portion. And be liable to the injured party for all resulting damages. Now, because this law specifically applies to livestock, you can run up a pretty substantial bill here if something goes badly enough. But let's talk about the disputes that this thing applies to. So you don't have to view every fence. Since 2017, this thing applies only when both landowners have livestock. So we've got our statutory language there. Minnesota Statute 344.03, subdivision 1 in parens A, if two adjoining lands are both used in whole or in part to produce or maintain livestock for agricultural or commercial purposes, and one or both of the owners of the land desires the land to be partly or totally fenced, the landowners or occupants shall build and maintain a partition fence between their lands in equal shares. So even if only one side wants this thing to be built, but both sides have and keep livestock for, quote, agricultural or commercial purposes, unquote, then you are potentially in the neighborhood of a dispute that could get you or get your township roped into this thing. Now, livestock is defined pretty broadly. Beef, cattle, dairy cattle, swine, poultry, goats, donkeys, hinnies, mules, farmed deer, flightless birds, bison, sheep. They include specifically horses, alpacas, and llamas. So it's pretty broad there. But it does have to be done for this, quote, agricultural or commercial purposes. They don't naturally define that for us. But just so you know, there is that limitation there. Okay. So even if you have proper properties and proper uses of those properties, that is not enough to rope you into the dispute. There also has to be a proper kind of dispute. So, the law starts by presuming that both landowners are adults and they are capable of working out the details between the two of them. There's that provision that we saw earlier that says they're supposed to divide it up equally between the two of them. And we only get involved when somebody complains to us. And even then, it has to be the right kind of dispute. So the common types are listed here. So failing to build your fence, failing to maintain it, failing to rebuild it, refusing to agree on how to divide the costs, disagreements over that kind of fencing, or what side of if there's a body of water, is it on this side, is it on that side? These are all potentially in our purview. Now, one major type of dispute that is pretty common, that is something that we don't deal with, is boundary disputes. So fence viewers do not have any authority to set or determine boundary lines. So if that's the nature of the dispute that you are potentially looking at here, then you do get to say, hey, look, we don't have any authority over this. You need to go to the courts. But yes, so one of the disputes that is potentially possible here is whether or not somebody is using the right kind of fence. You can't just use any sort of fence. There's a fairly detailed list. Now, the real point of this presentation is just sort of to make sure, hey, look, if one of these comes to you, I want that little antenna to go up in your head and be like, oh, wait, maybe there's something to this. This might be legitimate. We potentially could be on the hook if something goes wrong. And so to start asking those questions, the important thing is to make sure that you have the resources. So you're remembering that this is potentially one of your responsibilities, and you have the resources to then go figure out what your specific responsibilities are. But this is one of the more common types of disputes, and this one is actually covered by the law, entertainingly enough. Now, nearly uniquely, in Minnesota statutes, there are some just kind of wild exemptions to this thing. It is really very much a reflection of its original time and its original place. And I think that's made clear by these two families of exemptions that this thing is subject to. First one is kind of the small ball one. So there's something called a local option policy, which if you don't think this is a good fit for your community, if you don't think it's a good use of public resources, you do, as a town board member, as a town board, excuse me, have the authority to sort of limit your exposure to these disputes. So the relevant statute is 344.011. It's called local option policy. And here is the operative language here. Town board may, by resolution, exempt adjoining owners or occupants from fence viewing law when their land considered together is less than 20 acres. So particularly for these small disputes, you do have the authority to just sort of pass a resolution saying, look, we're going to exempt you from this. We're not going to deal with it. Even more unusual than that, there is this other statute, Minnesota statute 344.20, which permits electors to sort of grant kind of a pretty blanket exception from the law entirely. So the process works like this. First, you got to get a petition. It has to be 8 or more landowners from the town. If you get that petition, then the town board can adopt its own policies. So you can have your own dispute resolution policies. You can have pretty comprehensive. There's not much limiting language in this thing. Now, we don't have a court case saying you can completely exempt the township from this law in its entirety, but it does appear that is a possible interpretation of this thing. So as far as I know, nobody's actually tried that. It hasn't been tested in court. But in theory, that interpretation is kind of hanging out there if you want to if you don't think this is a good use of public resources. Okay, after the board adopts its policy, then it is sent to the electors at the annual meeting. And then if the electors approve it, Chapter 344 does not apply in that town, which is kind of crazy. I am not familiar with any other example of any other generally applicable statute in the state of Minnesota that has anything like that. So I just thought that was pretty interesting here. But for those of you who are potentially facing one of these disputes, or potentially, just interested in a little bit more of the details, we do have a fairly detailed guide on this. So it's in the Minnesota Association of Townships Information Library under Town Duties. What you're looking for is document TD 5000. It's got checklists for the common dispute types. So it's got multiple dispute types, and this is what you do here, this is what you do there. It's got sample notices. This is a quasi-judicial process, so you do have to sort of give proper notices. And it's got sample orders, sort of resolving these potential disputes. So this thing is designed to make it as painless as possible. If somebody comes to you with one of these petitions, one of these complaints, we've tried to make it as painless as possible for you to discharge your statutory obligations here. All right. Well, folks, does anybody have any questions? All right. Well, in that case, thanks very much for your time and for your attention. I hope it was helpful. And yeah, I will vote. Future, it'd be nice if Matt could recap the hair splitting regarding the town issue in Hillman Township. Oh, so we certainly could do kind of a deep dive into that particular case. Now that one was one of the star cases of, I believe, the first district meeting that I attended back when I was first starting at Matt. I do think that kind of this. So that was a case that was interpreting Minnesota Statute 365.10, I believe. So the electors, the limits of the electors' authority to say yes or no to reopening an abandoned road, and what sort of obligations the town had with respect to that kind of stuff. Yeah, be happy to throw that on at some point. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time and for your attention. If you got any questions, please don't hesitate to give me a call, shoot me an email, and have a nice morning.